Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
So I'm sitting in the palatial office of Dr Don Vinson, University of Worcester. Don, welcome to the Talent Equation.
Ah, amazing. This has been a little while in coming. Everybody says that on the podcast. But no, really excited to be having this chat. Thanks for the invite. It's great. And
what I'm glad is as much as we've tried to plan this and sort of missed each other, it's happened by pure chance that I happen to be in your neck of the woods and you happen to have a meeting cancelled. Yeah. So in true fortuitous emergent style, here we are.
It's great, isn't it? 2 hours ago this wasn't on, and then suddenly bang. Really. So great.
So as a starting point, question I always open with really is just kind of your story. What are you doing? I know you work in this world of coaching and all that sort of stuff. I'm fortunate enough to live in this world we operate within. Just tell me the whole story.
Oh gosh, the heart of it is I love coaching, and ever since really I was quite young, just wanted to work in sport. Really didn't understand what that would look like early on, and went to university to be a PE teacher because that's the only thing you can do in sport when you're 18, isn't it? You think, and fast realised that actually, this academic stuff is quite cool. Really, I like this. And very quickly found that that's what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an academic. I felt kind of that was what I was designed to be, if you like. I thought I can contribute in this world, but I've always said I want to be, I want to work in that world because I think I've got some skills and abilities I can contribute there, but I love coaching, so I really want to keep a handle on being an active coach all the time, and that has since emerged into enabling me to do some coach educating stuff as well. So, and I really love that. So I've tried to keep a really nice balance of being a sort of very applied academic, and as you get on in your academic career, you tend to be able to focus more and more on the stuff that you really want to do, and perhaps do slightly less of the stuff you don't want to do. So I started my academic career looking at a lot of physical activity and health and adherence to that kind of thing, which is really important, great, but my real heart was proper bibs, balls and cones coaching, that kind of stuff. So the more I've been able to do, the more I've been able to tailor it to that. So now my academic role is sort of purely looking after our postgraduate sports coaching program at the university, and we have an internal program almost that is an extension of our undergraduate stuff that has lots of young coaches. They're 22, 21 mostly, trying to find their way in the world of coaching. So we're still trying to help them form their identity and what they believe in and that kind of thing. Still at that stage, and they're trying to build a professional profile. So that's a big chunk of what I do. Then we have an external facing variant of the program, if you like, where we go out to people and we deliver our courses CPD for organisations. So we do quite a lot of work at the moment with the FA. We take our program to them, and that again is about working with people to try and work through why they do what they do, what's the evidence that underpins it from an academic perspective. Now those guys are obviously much more accomplished and seasoned professionals, but might not necessarily have gone quite so far with their academic stuff as our typical home students have done. So it's a very different challenge, but motivated in the same way. It's about learning, it's about helping people to critique the evidence on which they base their practice. So that's the university stuff, and obviously there's the I try and, as much as I can, write about that stuff as much as I can, so it all overlaps. Coaching-wise, I was retired quite early to coach because I knew, well, I thought I was going to be a better coach than I was a player. So put playing aside in late 20s and thought I'm going to coach, and had a really good opportunity to coach a good women's national league team in field hockey, and did that for 5, 6, 7 years or so, and loved it. It was just fantastic, and affirmed to me, because that was my first coaching role, that it was, the main thing that I did in my sport. That was absolutely the heart of what I wanted to do. I loved every minute of that. And then off the back of that, sort of when that finished, moved into the national age group system. So I've been working for the last 3 years with the England under-16 girls as an assistant coach in that programme, which is massively different from the club coaching environment. Just unbelievably different, but really fantastic. I wasn't sure when I stepped into it whether this was going to be for me on all kinds of levels. Both from working for the institution, for the boss, as opposed to always being on the outside and stepping into the system. What is this actually going to be like? Is this going to be... And then going from working with a team who were averaged over 30 in age to working with 14 and 15 and 16-year-old girls, which was, again, massively different. So I wasn't sure it was going to be for me, but the more I've done it, the more I've loved it. Really, so really passionate about that.
And also, probably worth mentioning that we're both obviously actively involved in developing and educating other coaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
In lots of different ways.
Yeah, so I'm. We've both sort of grasped some workshops, essentially, haven't we? Been charged with delivering some of those to the hockey community.
Yeah.
So I've been in that network for the last 3-4 years or so, I guess, delivering various bits and pieces of right from sort of intro to hockey stuff, which is for absolute novice coaches or just helpers or that kind of thing, through to the advanced coaching program, which is currently the I don't know what word is for it, what England Hockey would call it, but it's, I guess, the most bespoke package that they offer as a development tool for coaches in the system. So working across that range, and again, just I love that in many ways. It's quite frustrating also because you get such little time with in any of those environments as compared to, say, working in a university where our course largely is set up for a part-time basis for 2 years worth of study. So most students who come in, we sit down and we really are taking that quite, well, it's not long term, but it's a longer term perspective of saying, okay, we're going to work with you for a couple of years here. And that means we can do an awful lot more tailoring, an awful lot more sit back and think. And we just get to know people so much more deeply and richly with the time that comes. So the 3-hour nature of most of the workshops that we deliver for England Hockey, I find great but frustrating in that way. You just think, I'm just only ever scratching the surface here of what learning is really about. And just hoping then that you're just hoping you're a part of the chain that's in somebody's development. But
I think the thing that I get, I suppose I keep myself, makes me feel happier about it, as limited as it is. There's a couple of things. One is when you see the light bulbs go off. And then the other one is knowing that in my learning journey, nothing like that existed.
No, indeed.
And so actually, the very fact that that's being provided for people to get an opportunity to learn both formally and informally is brilliant, because I set this podcast up, but also part of the reason is because I went through that kind of 15-20 years. I've talked about it at length, the wilderness years. But and in that time, it's pretty lonely. And you've got a sort of itch. There's got a sense in the back of your mind that there's not. This isn't right. I'm not it's not quite what I thought it would be. There's the kind of frustration. You get some pushback. You've got these issues, all that sort of stuff. You haven't got the skill. Just haven't got the skill to deal with it. And now it feels to me like if you're a young coach or somebody embarking on your career, whether you're young or young as a coach, the opportunities for learning are far greater than they ever were before.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. So many more things on the menu to choose from, which is great in many ways. But I still think the needs for quality facilitation of that is still much needed. And you say in a higher education environment, you've got people for such a long time, and you've got relatively small groups and very stable relationships. Then you get quite a good sense of people's journey in that, and so those light bulbs do go off, not regularly, but it's not uncommon. But yeah, helping people to find those pieces, those right pieces of the menu, to digest them, to unpack them, to critique them in many ways. That's what gets me going, I guess, or keeps me coming in anyway.
Just to switch back to something you said earlier on, talking about the difference between the club role and the national role.
Yeah.
Why are they so different?
Because I would like to think that I try and live out as many of the things that I preach as possible. One of those is being genuine and authentically athlete-centred. Now, there's been some debate about that, perhaps recently, but I'm still firmly signed up to this badge. But what that means for me is to put the athletes at the first and foremost at the heart of the process. So I call that being servant-hearted. So I think it's a good servant leadership model. So I think if you do that, then it means you've got to start from the needs of the athletes. And for the group that I was working with in a club environment, for many of them, and I've got a group of them together, this was the pinnacle of what they were going to do in hockey. We were playing in the Premier League, that was it. And to be honest, it was not necessarily a struggle, but it was going to be, the focus of each season was staying in it, essentially. We were never going to challenge the top guy. So it was, for a lot of the athletes, it was, can we maintain this Premier League status where it wasn't just about the label at all, but it was about the quality of the hockey. These girls were just feeling they were being stretched like they'd never been stretched before. They were loving playing. They'd loved playing against the big guns and that challenge. And for the majority of the team, that was it. It was about that. So my approach to that then was trying to ensure that was a really good, affirming, uplifting environment. We'd frequently lose. In the league we were in, I think, I forget, I'd hate to think what our win-loss record was, but we definitely lost a lot more than we won. And often, when the big guns came to town, we'd get hammered. And we used to rejoice if we could keep it tight and contested all the way through. Not rejoice, but it was that was a bonus, if you like, if we could keep it tight all the way through. But sometimes a big team would rock up and they'd beat us 6-0, and that was. But so my focus there was can we ensure that their experience of hockey, even though we were losing quite a bit, was really positive, was really was understanding where we were as a group and rejoicing in that, and saying, look, we're doing really well here, and to believe in each other and to lift each other up and to be overtly positive all the time in that journey. And I think overall I was pretty happy with that approach. So I think that is very different from a national role, when your perspective absolutely is on providing a very positive journey, but this is now about long-term development. So we're planting the seeds for what we hope might not mature for 5-10 years even, and to have that very long-term perspective is very different from the club perspective. We really need to amass enough points to stay up in this league. So that means actually we need to win on Saturday, or we need to get some points from Saturday because it's really important. And that pressure it just doesn't occur, just doesn't happen in the national group at all.
And I imagine, there's a lot of this talk about this idea of form of life and how that affects individuals as coaches. And the environment affects methodology. So pragmatically, I can imagine in the club context where the outcome is primary, methodologically, you're working differently than in the talent development space where you've got a long-term picture of athlete development and outcomes are less relevant. I know there are points in time in the season where they are, but primarily it's a learning and development opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so methodologically, you're working differently.
Slightly,
right?
Yes, in that in a club environment there is more importance placed on consensus of understanding what we're trying to do as a team.
Okay.
So, for example, if we're setting up a pressing system in a club environment, I would be more focused on ensuring that everybody was really clear about what we were doing with this and essentially what is correct in that environment. Where should you stand? We need to. I'd be more focused on that side of things. Whereas in the talent development environment, we need to prepare the young people to be able to deploy a whole range of different approaches to, in this case, team defence. So that we haven't got the time to nail down 7 different systems that we might do. So I'm not sure that would be right anyway. So we work to much broader principles of what we might be trying to do with the athletes. So they'd both be principle led in a way, but I think you'd be much more detailed, much more focused in a club environment where you're trying to be successful on Saturday. Just much more longer term in the development environment where we're trying to plant some seeds. We're trying to ensure that they have at least heard some of the language that they will hear as they go on in their journey. So if they move from 16s to 18s, that is a smooth transition and that the language is relatively similar and it doesn't appear to contrast from one stage to the next. I don't know how important that is, but...
And I imagine that within the 16s environment, or that you've got more of an opportunity for exploration. As those individuals are, identifying and coming up with creative solutions to the problems that you present. Whereas with the time constraints of a club role, because it's an amateur sport, so most people have got jobs and stuff. So getting them, you do well, don't you, to have, say, 2 hours a week. Yeah. Sometimes if you've got a particularly committed group, even at Premier League level, but particularly you might have 4 hours a week of training time. Yeah. And in that relatively limited contact time, you've got to kind of squeeze the juice out of it, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was part of the joy of going to the 16s role when actually suddenly we've got more than half a pitch to work on. Do you mean we don't have to sweep it for litter first? That's remarkable. And the time constraint is different as well. So, in a club environment, our club hired a pitch. We didn't have our own pitch, which was a frustration throughout because it meant that essentially you were counting down the seconds to get on the pitch and you were certainly being counted down to get off the pitch at the end. Yeah. So that meant you had to take a really focused and very pragmatic view sometimes to what are we going to do in this time. Whereas the 16s, there are some of those things, but generally it's a much more fluid and open, and certainly the pressures of space and time don't apply to the same degree. So,
which enables you to. So this is I was talking about this morning in a workshop this morning, and I was talking about this athlete-centered or player-centeredness as an idea, and one of the people in the room said, "I think it's a bit of an overused phrase. It's a bit of a buzzword." I was a bit like, "It's interesting," but I think kind of what it came down to was. And the way I sort of think about it is, it's not really a thing in itself. I see it more as a spectrum, and that's dependent on the environmental constraints placed on the coach. So the amount you can be truly athlete-centered is determined by your limitations. So, for example, in the club role, where you've got a certain amount of time, a certain amount of and an outcome, and you're looking at results in a different way, your approach might not be exactly aligned to what the athletes would want if they had a perfect scenario sometimes. So you might have to be, for example, whereas you would probably, as much as you possibly could, want to be, very much about questioning and eliciting information from them, and you would probably stay true to that methodology as much as possible. But you may have to slide into, tell you what, girls, it's just going to need to be like this. Because, which isn't particularly athlete-centred, because you're not really bringing the learner on the journey, but the time constraints are such that you have to operate in that way. It goes back to that point around form of life. And so I see player-centredness as being almost like a slider on a spectrum, dependent on the situation the coach finds themselves in. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I would argue, though, and I don't think this is just semantics, but that to control the degree to which athletes are empowered, that's what we're talking about. And I agree absolutely then with that sliding scale. I think you can legitimately make that decision as a coach to give athletes a lot of power and a lot of control, or at other times to say, I'm not going to give you a choice, or actually I'm going to give you a choice of just this or A or B. I think that all of that is perfectly athlete-centred. It's 100% athlete-centred for me, because it's about making an appropriate decision about the level of empowerment. So the heart is still there, absolutely. And now this is, but the phrase you they'll go back to there, you say it's an overused phrase that somebody said to you this morning. This is what the academic stuff can do really detrimentally sometimes. It's to take a concept like athlete-centred coaching, for me, and batter it. And to say, well, look, we've investigated the practice of 20 coaches and they don't get it. They don't really understand what athlete-centred coaching is, and therefore it's a defunct phrase. It doesn't mean anything, it's meaningless. And I think sometimes the academic world can do that quite a lot. It's almost quite snobbish about it. And you see articles out there, and they've done it to athlete-centred coaching, they've done it to reflective practice, they've done it to coach education. It's a very highbrow, you don't get this concept, so it doesn't matter, or it doesn't really work, or you're not really entitled to use it. And I hate that. I really hate it. I think it's unhelpful at best. But it's what happens to a lot of good concepts, that people will understand stuff at a different level, at different degrees of complexity. So, and the classic at the moment, I'd say, would be things like growth mindset. Okay, so the trouble is, if you try and articulate brilliant concepts like athlete-centred coaching, you try and boil it down, you end up saying, oh, it's about this, and you say it in a sentence or a word or two. And essentially, yes, it is. But if you then adopt that as the thing, then it becomes a very simplistic version of that concept. Well, of course it does. You've explained it in a sentence, or you've shown a figure on a presentation of, say, a Gibbs reflective cycle. There are 6 parts to it. And this is classically what students will do. Will say, here are the 6 stages of Gibbs reflective cycle. And they will say, yes, and now we understand Gibbs reflective cycle. Well, yes, you've seen the diagram and you understand the words. But the trouble is, if you then boil it down and then say, this is the understanding of it as people work it, then of course people don't get it in the theoretical depth which you might want in the academic world. But to shoot people down for that I don't think that's particularly helpful.
Because then the people out there who could benefit most, practitioner, for example, who has a less than perfect understanding of something, but it's useful for them, then doesn't know where to turn. And then they're like, well, now who do I listen to? And then the danger then is that, well, I'm not going to listen to sources of, peer-reviewed, evidence-based literature, because I know that if I follow this idea for now, probably in about a couple of years' time, it won't be in vogue anymore, and I'll be told it's a load of old rubbish. Classic example would be how warm-ups over the years have changed, and it's all about dynamics now, and everyone's shoeing the chickens and all that, and then in a couple of years' time it'll be back, and so people just don't really know what to do. And I think it comes back to your point, though, and this was where we went this morning, funnily enough, was the reason for even asking that was what is your understanding of the term, of the phrase?
Yeah.
Can we in a room collectively use our shared insight to arrive at a kind of shared idea of what player-centeredness might be?
Yeah.
And if we can, then we can go away with something that we can use as a reference point. Because we probably haven't even asked that question ever. We've just heard this idea and we've either decided, that sounds like it's something cool and I'm going to do something with that, or that sounds like a bit of old fluffy nonsense and I'm not going to get, and it's an overused phrase and I'm going to reject it. So it feels to me like, I think you're right, I have criticised members of your profession for that very thing. But at the same time, I think that's why it's incumbent on people like me, people like yourself out there as a practitioner, in some respects, actually having conversations like this to say, what does this idea even mean to you? Yeah. And then other people can take what they want from that.
There's great truth in that, I think. I'd love to give people confidence to stick to their guns and stick with that phrase. Athlete-centered is a classic example. I hope that the criticism of it doesn't lead to it being debunked in the way that some other things have been, like, oh, that's old hat, because I fundamentally think there's great value in the principle. And if it is as simple for some people, what does it mean to you? It means putting my athletes first. It's their consideration first.
Yeah.
Done. That's it. You are athlete-centered. Now, if you want to explore that a bit more and you want to tackle some of the deeper principles, then okay, we can go there. We can, if you want to. But I really hope we don't throw that particular baby out with the bathwater.
Well, I think what helps is, and this is why athlete-centeredness sometimes is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, is if we have a really good understanding of kind of who we are as coaches and what we're doing, why we're doing it, and have a bit of a more in-depth understanding of some of the theoretical basis of what our approach is based upon. You've made me think, I'm smiling because you've made me think about the time with when I was coaching again a women's team. Actually a really good friend of mine I happened to bump into on the train the other day, and I remember distinctly this moment where we were having a discussion about a particular thing. I can't exactly remember what the actual thing was, and I was asking her lots of questions, and at one point she said, "Just tell me what to do." And I thought to myself, and I said to her, well, look, if I do that, the problem is that yes, you will hear it from me, but I'm not sure you will necessarily then own the solution we've come up to. We're jointly trying to find the solution here. But I remember going away from it thinking, maybe I wasn't very athlete-centered there, because she wanted something from me and I wasn't prepared to give it. Was I being too dogmatic? Now, I've reflected on it since, and I feel like, no, because what she wanted wasn't what she needed.
Indeed. That's the heart of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's understanding the need then, isn't it? And absolutely, it's right to withhold a solution or to only give a partial solution because you know that people need to discover that, or you believe that people need to discover it for themselves and to figure it out. And if anything, then my academic career affirms that all the time. Yeah. When you do have the freedom to take your time with people. And students will commonly want a solution from you. I don't understand this. Will you explain it to me? Well, I'll help you to understand it as best I can, but I'm always going to try and get them to figure it out for themselves as best as they possibly can. Yeah. And so I will take that approach absolutely into all of my coaching, because it's fundamentally comes back to the heart of learning, doesn't it? And what you believe about learning. And for me, that means piecing stuff together. And if you can help people to construct that in a really well-informed and balanced way, then I think that's what we're about.
Definitely. It's probably, hopefully, where this conversation will go a little bit, is one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit of late, and it links to this point about dogmatism. I know I'm pretty susceptible to that, in the sense that I can get quite fixated on something, and if I have a belief in a particular course of action or a particular philosophical idea or political idea or anything like that, I can get quite guilty of almost wallowing in the echo chamber, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I've been conscious a little bit that this podcast gets a bit like that sometimes, because I get like-minded people on and we have really nice conversations about things that we both really like. But and that's where sometimes I think it's the challenge is with this particular work is, when does my belief in something, which I believe to be evidence-based, I feel like I've spent a lot of time studying and exploring and meeting people, having conversations like this, which either affirm or challenge my belief. But if I've got this belief, and then that means that I'll usually hold pretty steadfast to my approach, because it's a core part of the belief in terms of how I help people best. But the danger in that, isn't there? There's a danger is that it becomes dogmatic, and I'm not then serving them best. And so I'm conscious that one of the things you do brilliantly, and you ask your students to do, is you ask them to always kind of critically evaluate and go and why, and explore what's the other options here, and so you're kind of you're almost it's almost that kind of what's the word, that genuine sort of critical evaluation all the time, isn't it? We think this, but it could be something else, and let's explore the differences. So how would a practitioner such as myself, with a potential to go into that kind of dogmatic world, how do you think you can kind of create those checks and balances for yourself, or what's the approach what approach do you use in the work that you do on a day-to-day with students to help them avoid the pitfalls, I suppose? Probably a better way of phrasing the question.
Well, it is a bit about pitfalls, but I guess some of the things that we've already talked about have become very commonly accepted. So when for our postgraduate students, they would commonly call themselves an athlete-centered coach, because it's almost universally accepted as being a good thing. And I think we've sort of got to that stage, perhaps in our coach education journeys, where non-linear practices are generally accepted to be good things. And so that's where they'll come from. So my approach will be to that the same as it was 10 years ago, in a certain sense, to critique, but I'll be coming at it now from the other angle. Whereas we used to be trying to throw a bit of a curveball and say, well, is there a different way to this stop, stand still, demonstrate type approach? Now we're saying, okay, but is there another way? Are you sure this is a credible way forwards? So part of the stuff we begin with our postgrad students is to say, okay, let's review the evidence for games-based approaches.
Okay.
For example.
Yeah.
Okay, because they would be a suite of approaches where people say, people generally sort of tick the box. Say, yeah, great, games-based approaches, great way forward, isn't it? Okay, let's look at the evidence. And when you dig into the evidence, it's pretty thin.
Right.
Pretty thin, particularly if you are looking for evidence of objective benefit to the learner, to the end user, saying, do they actually get better? And the evidence is really thin, and the ways that people have tried to show it are full of holes, because it's really complicated to try and measure that stuff. So when you dig down, I think there are giant gaps there still to be had. So from our postgrad worlds, that's often where I'll come from. I'll try and just dig a little bit at the evidence that underpins some of their very commonly held beliefs by that stage, that they think are kind of accepted in the industry as being good things: athlete-centeredness, games-based approaches, non-linear approaches. Okay, can we dig at that a little bit more? I guess for the non-student, for the everyday coach who's going about their business, I would encourage them to come from the perspective that we really want people to be secure in their knowledge and to really have a well-established belief about why they do what they do. So I'm with you in the sense that I think you should rigorously defend why you do what you do and have a really good base to that. But I think then it's quite potentially pretentious of us sometimes to then say, now this truth that I've created for myself, with all of my cultural nuance and understanding and all the influences that have gone on in my life that have led me to this point, if I then try and take this and say, and therefore this must also be true for you in your context, then I think we're committing a bit of a faux pas there. And I think if you then look at any other person, they will have a different perspective on this stuff. And I almost take it and say, well, how dare I say that I know more about this than you? Okay, I've come to my belief about this, but I don't necessarily believe I have the right to tell anybody else that their approach is wrong and my approach is right.
Yeah, what's interesting about that as a practitioner, and I take your point, and I do want to kind of circle back to the evidence for.
Okay.
But one of the things about that I think is quite an important area. I've had this before where I've been working with a group of coaches and talking about, for example, non-linear pedagogy and constraint-led approach, and they would say things like, I think they sort of see it as a bit of a fad, like they've seen before, and it's going to blow over, and they'll be able to go back to what they were doing. Because quite a few governing bodies have like really embraced this approach. You know, they've seen the value of its possibilities, and I think they want to really commit to it. Our own, very committed. And so one of the things I think about that is I say to those individuals, well, you've got a lifetime of experience of coaching in one way. You can only really truly evaluate the value of an alternative approach if you've fully committed to that as an alternative. And then you can begin to give yourself some sort of practical understanding of which methodology probably fits best for you. But you've got to make that commitment. So I suppose in my kind of world, you know, I've kind of personally, I suppose, said, right, well, I've done all that, I've done this stuff, I found it pretty unsatisfactory, and in my search for answers, I found something else. So I'm going to explore that for a bit. And then if at some point in time I find, actually, I haven't quite got the answer here either, then I'll start to explore elsewhere, or I'll go back. But that's a conscious choice. Whereas, and that's one of my concerns is that some people are kind of either going, right, I'll go along with this whilst they keep saying that we've got to do it, or they're going, this sounds interesting and I like what that person talks about, so I'm going to do that too. It's different. It's not a choice. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. The authenticity there, I think, is really important. That if you try and adopt something but you haven't bought into it, or you don't really believe it, then I think there's inherent limitation there, because I think coaching is so dependent on context and your belief that you are inherently part of it, and your makeup and the way that you are and the way that you speak to people is inherently part of what's going to be successful for you as a coach. So I am never going to be suited to autocracy and to be a shouter and a baller and a swearer. That's never going to be me.
Not your style.
So it's never going to be the approach that works for me, regardless of whether anybody categorically proves, air quotations going on, that it's the best approach or the most effective approach. But I would also come back to students quite a lot with tongue-in-cheek examples. And it comes. One of my former students said to me once, have you ever come across a coach called Viktor Turkhanov? And I hadn't at the time, and I thought, okay, no. Tell me about him. And he was former Russian ice hockey coach. He was a member of the army in Russia, and he ruled, literally, that regime with an absolute iron fist. Ultimate dictator, controlled the athletes' lives as much as their on-ice performance. Absolute dictator. Quite a barbaric regime in many ways. You can imagine what it was like. I used to think. Wins 3 gold medals at the Olympics, and think, well, if we're going to talk about effectiveness, then what is effective or what is success? Then be careful, I guess, what you wish for, because there is quite clear evidence that says you can be successful with a very linear, autocratic solution, if that is your context and you're just about winning. And you can see that in a lot of regimes all the time. You think, well, okay, so if we must be careful as advocates of non-linear pedagogy, I think that what we're preaching isn't necessarily something that we can never deliver on. If we're going to say this is the only way you'll get success, well, what is success, but B, I'm really cautious that this isn't the only way. So this is part of my challenge to the non-linear advocates, and I'm signing myself up here. So absolutely, if we ever pitch it that, our approach here, our non-linear approach works, and you learn nothing from doing it any other way, we're setting ourselves up for a fall here. I think there is clearly some benefit from lots of different styles of practice. And at the very simple example, if somebody rushed into this office now and said, in 30 minutes time, I'm going to give you a test of shooting basketball free throws, for example, and if you don't score 8 out of 10 in half an hour, then we're going to imprison you. Then you can bet that the thing that we might be best doing for the next half an hour is to take lots of basketball free throws. And we might randomise that practice slightly or whatever, but we will do quite a specific and quite a focused practice in that sense. So the context of it, I think, is really important. So we would be better going and taking some shots than just sitting here for another half an hour or doing some other completely unrelated activity. And the message then is, I think, look, for me, what we're trying to do all the time is trying to find the best possible mixture is the wrong word, sorry. We're trying to find the best possible recipe for the ingredients that we've got. And sometimes we're going to take some very pragmatic decisions. Sometimes we're going to adjust the control dial. I know you've talked about dialing up and dialing down. I'm thoroughly with you on that. And sometimes that means we might come away from our ideals because it's pragmatically the best thing to do in this situation. And I only think that we need to just be a bit cautious with being too black and white about our approach here to saying this is right and this is wrong. And I guess that's part of my criticism over some of the stuff that comes out in the constraints approaches, whereby extreme, I would say almost radical thinkers in that regime would say that there is no benefit from doing a decontextualized practice whatsoever. And I absolutely am signed up to the, hey, make your practice as contextualized as you possibly can, absolutely. But to say that there is no benefit from doing a decontextualized practice, I'm not sure I'm with that. And I think there are times when perhaps one of our under 16 girls has said, look, I can access a pitch, but it's just me on my own. What can I do? I think there's benefit to saying, you could maybe set up a little practice that's like this.
Yeah.
And I think that's more beneficial than saying, don't bother, because it's not contextualized. And I also think there is danger in some of the practices that we would design as non-linear advocates, and sometimes we would set up a 3v3 practice or a 4v4 practice, and I don't think we have the evidence at the moment that says you can transfer and secure from those kind of environments to a full game environment. Show me the evidence for that. I don't think it exists. We believe that we're creating the most highly contextual situation perhaps that we can in that particular situation, but that doesn't mean that it's going to transfer well. So there was a piece of football research that came out last year that tried to look at some of those things and suggested that the sort of 7v7 medium was the best balance between the real environment and creating lots of repetition without repetition on the ball. And that had just resonated with me on a number of levels as I'd become a little bit disenfranchised with the whole very small-sided game thing and struggling a bit with the transfer argument in those. So I'm tending to do now a lot more slightly larger-sided activities in my practice design because I think they do look more like the game and they are more contextually relevant in that sense.
It's something that Keith Davids said to me when I was fortunate enough to spend some time with him over in Ireland, was his concern is that people are over-constraining.
Yeah.
And part of the reason they're over-constraining is because they're not clear on intent. So your practice design, or your practice form, let's say, needs to be very clearly linked to what your intent is. So I know, and this is a phrase I've been using a lot recently as well, is that when is it representative enough? Because clearly we can't, the most representative thing is the full game, but you can't do that all the time because you don't always have a full pitch, and people wouldn't get enough goes. So what we're doing is we're reducing space and numbers in order to condense down moments in time that are likely to occur in a game, to give players more opportunities to experience those moments and solve those problems. But I think unless you're really clear about that, so this is what we're doing here, and we know that this is imperfect, but we're happy to stomach that. We're not going to make the perfect the enemy of the good, one of my favourite phrases. Because we recognise that the constraints we have here mean that we're going to do it in this way. And sometimes that might mean, because of the constraints, like you say, it could be that you're doing unopposed type stuff. So my challenge to coaches, though, is if we conceive of learning in a physical domain, and I'm not going to go off on a tangent on educational research, but if we conceive of learning in a physical domain as being very linked to context and very linked to problems, and the problems that are being presented in any kind of game, whether they're technical problems or they require technical solutions or they require tactical solutions or whatever it might be, and we're going to work backwards from those to allow the athlete to, not allow, wrong phrase, but to give the athlete opportunity to explore the possible range of solutions that are out there. If we're going to look at it that way, then we are going to, from a methodological standpoint, we're going to need to work in that way. So logically, I can't conceive of an unopposed practice form that will do that. I just can't conceive of one. I can't actually think of it. And there may be one, and somebody can help me with that, but I can't think of it. So therefore, I'm led to working in that way, because the logic is telling me that's the way I've got to go. So that's one of the dangers here. But yeah, and I'll never ever say that the unopposed practice opportunity has no value. The challenge is always, and this is sometimes perhaps I might make the mistake of saying this perhaps in the wrong way, or it's conceived like this, is that people assume that when I challenge unopposed activity, or drills, so to speak, that I'm doing so from the perspective of your activity is worthless, and I'm not. I'm saying, is there a way you could do that would just enrich it from a learning experience perspective? But and that's when I get accused of being what I've been called an eco-D warrior. And there's a couple of us out there, I suppose, who are tempted to do this because people post things on Twitter and what have you, and we say, well, really? And I suppose it's not that helpful in terms of stimulating the debate. But what's really interesting to me as well, though, is how hard people will hold on to an ideal. I'm doing it. I know I am. I'm really honest about that. But other people hold on to an ideal as well. And when you probe, they're holding on to it just because they're holding on to it. Not necessarily because there's a rationale behind holding on to it. Or maybe there is a rationale, there's a logical rationale. And actually part of it, I think, is just down to the fact that, and this is where I have a hard time, which is when you see the world through that. I have lived in a world of skill is an aggregation of technique. We break down the full thing, we do it in its chunks, and then we assemble it again on the field and hope it's all going to stick together like magic. I've done that, and it never worked for me.
No, indeed.
It did a bit, but it was always a bit limited. There was something missing. So when you see the world as, well, we're not going to do that now. What we're going to do is we're going to say game, problem, athlete, organism, interaction between the two, and potential solutions emerge. When you see the world that way, it's really hard to look at it the other way. I find it very hard, I have to say.
I understand that, absolutely. And I think And yeah, and I'm signed up to that. It's, but it's, I say, part of it is approaching it in the right way, isn't it? And how you how you pitch that argument, absolutely. But recognising as well that from an academic perspective, you know, we're charged with finding a unique contribution to knowledge. It's the bit that we will polish and say, this is our bit, this is out there, and that's a bit of a failing of academia in that sense. That, and perhaps that encourages us to hold on to our ideals or our little thing that we've developed, and we've got to hold on to it because that's actually what's formed our professional identity in that sense. And I'm nowhere near that, by the way, but I'm thinking of those really, you know, cool professors who have a lifetime of work to get to a point where they say, look, here's my life's work, this is what I think it's about. And I understand that, and they've got to defend that and say this is where we've come to, what we believe to be true. So, but genuinely, I think the more you work with coaches, the more you understand it's a journey that will be in flux for a lot of people, and they will go through periods of signing up to certain things, believing in things. They'll wrestle with stuff, they'll reject other things, and I think that's fine. And what I think we mustn't do, and what I think sport is often guilty of, is pitching that there is a right way to do it. And this was part of my fear of walking into an England hockey environment and sort of working for the system, and thinking, and I was still very. This shocked me to a certain extent because I thought I was quite secure in what I believed and what I did, but walking into that environment and thinking, oh, I'm not sure if I'm going to do this right. Again, even that, and I was shocked myself by thinking that, essentially thinking, you know, they're wearing the badge, so clearly they must know what the right way to do this is, and we do that in sport all the time. It's about badges and pedestals and pinnacles, and I just think we, as much as we can, if we can chip away at that and just encourage people to explore and to be secure in their insecurity, I think that's...
Having worked in governing body land for quite a long time, I can kind of understand why it happens though. So our own sport's done it, hasn't it? They've gone, it's not this, it's that. And only 6 or 7 years ago, it wasn't that, it was this. It was the opposite, wasn't it? I mean, I was working in that talent system. I did 3 weeks, and that was as long as I could last. Because I'm like, this is no fun for me, and it's no fun for them, and I'm not going to sign up to it. You know, this like repetition. And so I just opted out because I felt I'm just philosophically I'm just not aligned to that. And then obviously we've literally flipped, haven't we? Complete opposite of that. So it's not that anymore. We're now doing it this way, and we're pretty concrete on that, aren't we? It's like, right, we're gonna, you know, all our assessments of coaches, you know, on courses is all based on these sort of fundamental principles, linked to the sort of golden thread ideas and all those sorts of things, which are driven from non-linear and ecological thinking. But I understand why that is the case, because if you are a bit sort of it depends about it, it's not a very easy message to sell.
No, I understand that, but I've tried to put my 2 pence in this debate. I've never got very far, because I think there is great value in saying it depends, because I think it's true. I just think you've got to say it depends on,
of course.
It depends because, and to give some really concrete.
Because otherwise it's a cop out.
Well, it can be. I think probably. There's an argument to say, it's so complex, isn't it? It does depend on an infinitely large number of variables. So you can kind of understand and say, well, it depends because I can't list all of the alternatives or all the things it does depend upon. But I just think it would be helpful if you follow that up and say, okay, it depends. In this context, it might depend particularly perhaps on the relationship between the coach and the athlete, or the time that you've got available, or the pressures of competition, or the proximity of competition here, for example. I think that would help us. But I understand from a national governing body perspective, they have to be. But here's the thing: you're talking about assessment and the courses, and they can think. Well, if you step away and you think, well, what are the various systems designed on? The whole constructive alignment of learning objectives and the way that we assess on competency, for me, well, that doesn't sit alongside a complexity theory model. They're misaligned.
They are.
And so there's still some inherent inconsistencies and contradictions in the system that I think that's quite challenging, not only from an assessment perspective, but trying to get a head around where the governing body is seeing things and positioning it. Then some of the stuff we'll get from our coach ed colleagues, which is brilliantly constructively aligned, I don't think sits really comfortably with some of the more dynamical stuff that we'll get from a different part of the organisation. So I think that's quite challenging.
Funnily enough, I've noticed those tensions in some of the work I do on a daily basis, working with different sports as they are working to try and change, modernise, improve, transform their coach education systems, aligned with new policy.
Yeah.
And interestingly, you can see there's this kind of like coach development community that are very aligned to almost that kind of constructivist, I suppose, kind of ecological coach in situ. Let's work with them in their lived experience and help them solve the problems as they come up, and it's, and they're very comfortable with that as an ideal.
Yeah.
And they're working with colleagues who work in the what they call the coach education world, the qualifications world, that is a system that is built on an entirely different educational theory and foundation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Much more about, much more mechanistic, much more procedural, and I've noticed the dynamic tension in terms of they're talking past each other.
Yeah.
And I've raised this on a number of occasions, even internally. Whenever I've done assessments, it's not a necessary evil, but you have to do the box ticking. But I'll be honest, and I might be doing myself out of a job here, but I don't really conform, if I'm honest. I generally go, right, I've done an observation, I'll tick the boxes, I'll ask the questions, and now we'll have a proper conversation about the future of your coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if you've got a well-established belief on how people learn, and it is, you say, constructivist, and then you have to have that, don't you? It just doesn't sit to do it any other way. So, but I think that is a tension. That was a tension we've got in higher education as well. We're still founded upon constructive alignment and learning objectives and course objectives and module outlines, module objectives, and all these kind of things, which you kind of ignore for a large part because you can work your way around the system, but then we're not required to come back to that very tick that box, competent, yes. It's a fallacy, isn't it? It just doesn't exist. But how you would do that with a more complexity theory informed belief about how the world works is that's a whole other challenge, isn't it? How would you found a coach education system? And would you have assessment? I don't know.
Well, I think what you'd have is, in my head, I've got probably utopian vision of how coaches develop, but I think part of it's due to the fact of, and I think this is often how things happen, some of it's part to do with the belief I have around learning and development, and there's a lot made around the whole 70-20-10 rule of informal learning, on-the-job learning, etc., etc. But you don't see it. People talk about it, but you don't really see it. Because part of that is because I think often it's kind of, for people, there's too much uncertainty. There's too much, it's not. They want to be able to see evidence, and they're not prepared to take professional judgment.
Yeah, indeed.
It's too subjective.
Yeah.
And so we create all these tick boxes and everything else to give a kind of a veneer of objectivity, but it's an inherently subjective endeavour. Now, okay, I get it. There are some things there are some areas and some things that we want to, based on our belief around learning and the kind of behaviours we're looking for that are best suited, we hope, to athletes' engagement, because this is two things we're trying to do here. We're trying to engage them in sport, and we're also trying to help them learn and develop.
Yeah.
And sometimes those two things can be at odds with each other, but that's the aim. So we can create all that, and then we can work within that and understand the individual in their context and help them develop. So my view is that it should be more about not so much necessarily assessment in the sense of yes or no, but more an assessment from the perspective of, when I last saw you, we talked about these things, and you've gone away and reflected on those, put something in practice, read some stuff, and I'm now looking at you and I can really see that you've taken that on board, and now you're either acting or working or whatever, and you can see how that's moved on. Now I've got something else for you here that might be interesting for you to explore around, communicate, whatever it might be. So I feel like it's more like an ongoing professional discussion.
Yeah.
And at various points in time, that individual, if they choose to, could ask somebody to say, against this sort of professional status matrix that's been created by somebody, where am I? Because I'd quite like to have either an understanding of where I am and where my learning journey is next, or it's a requirement for employment or whatever it might be. So, but you don't have to get that. You can get that if it's important to you. And one of the reasons I'm very passionate about that is, at the moment, there's not really an incentive. The incentives are misaligned. It's not really an incentive to improve. So there are those of us out there who read a lot and work hard and are critically evaluating ourselves, having conversations, committing to CPD, etc., etc. But that doesn't give you anything.
No.
There's no benefit to you. Apart from maybe you're the type of person who gets the job for the 16s or this, that and the other, because people see that you're committed like that. But in my mind, I'm thinking I've been a level 3 coach for 20 years. And I'm on the same status as anybody who just qualified yesterday, or somebody who's been qualified for 20 years but has done nothing since then. And I feel like I would quite like to go, you know what, you're one of those individuals who's genuinely committed to your craft, and therefore you are recognised against your professional status with your peers as being.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the kind of world I conceive of, which makes total sense to me. But of course, it's quite a change, isn't it?
Well, it is, isn't it? But I think you look at most industries, that notion of continual professional learning and development it's just inherently part of it, isn't it? And of course it should be. The more that you can make that bespoke and individualised and all this, that's just principles of good learning, isn't it? In a professional sense.
It is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just circling back, actually, before I go off into my day job world too much, circling back to something you said earlier about the evidence for the games-based approach.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in exploring that in a little bit more detail, because I don't disagree. It would be very difficult to disagree. But I'm interested in why you think it is.
Yeah, okay.
And also then perhaps exploring, anyway, we'll start with that. Why do you think that? What makes you come to the conclusion that the evidence is thin?
So I've got a number of hang-ups, really, and I'll use these to maybe challenge the constraints-led community with these as well, because I'm starting this from a games-based approaches perspective.
Okay. Yeah.
So
yeah.
My undergraduate life, I don't know if it was first lecture or so, but very early on we were introduced to teaching games for understanding, and my journey with games-based approaches started there.
Yeah.
And has gone on since then. And I would absolutely still say I'm an advocate of games-based approaches. And 2016 was the previous International Teaching Games for Understanding conference in Germany, and Stephen Harvey stood up, and in his presentation he said, we've had a look at the because he wrote a review in 2014 or something of the literature. So we've identified something like over 1,000 articles that are advocating teaching games for understanding or games-based approaches as a way. And in one way, you're saying, look, isn't this great? Since we've got a real mass of evidence that is saying this is good stuff, this is great. And so part of me was like, wow, that is a lot. Wow, great. But then if you read his review article, or Paul Kinnock wrote one even more recently than that, and you start to drill down to the evidence that says, okay, what benefit can we see from games-based approaches? Now, this depends on what type of evidence you're going to accept as being evidence for an approach. So I'm quite a methodological jack of all trades. I'll take anything. But some people will say, for example, we're only going to take objective evidence. That is objective, probably largely quantitative evidence that there is a, for want of a better term, control-led design and an improvement in either technical or tactical capability efficiency from this particular type of approach. And if I use an example, an article that Stephen Harvey contributed to, it was about a netball intervention, a games-based netball intervention that they put in place, and they put in all kinds of controls of the veracity of what was actually being delivered. Is this a games-based approach? They did pre and post skills checks, if you like, before the intervention and after the intervention. Largely, I think they threw the kitchen sink at it in terms of trying to rigorously design and defend a games-based approach and to show that people improved through it. But there are still, for me, quite giant-sized gaps in the control of that kind of thing. I think almost it's impossible, because the environment is so impossible, to control it in such a way that you can say it's due to this coaching approach that these people have improved. Because there are so many other factors going on. You've got to think about so many other things in your research design in that sense that I'm not sure we're anywhere close to being able to design research well enough to capture it, let alone measure it properly. How do you measure decision making, really? There are some tools out there, so we have like the Games Performance Assessment Instrument, but they're really limited, they're really basic. And I've used the example of saying, well, if you think the most complicated card games out there, so one of my favourites is a game called Ligretto. You ever played it? It's like you can have up to 12 people playing all at the same time. Things are going off all over the place. It's really fast, and it's like we're measuring snap as a comparison. So our measures aren't up to it. If we're showing anything, it's really basic. And the design is so complicated. So objectively, I think we've got very limited objective evidence that this stuff makes a difference. And my fear for the constraints-led community would be similar. So if you're going to try and show that a constraints-led approach is effective, it makes a difference in a team sport environment, there's a whole load of lessons that you can take from the TGFU and from the games-based literature, who found this so difficult for so long in terms of how you might design that. So that's what leads me to think there's a lack of objective evidence. So that leads us back to the testimonial stuff, where most of the teaching games for understanding literature is based around teachers or coaches saying, I've tried this stuff, it's great, it really works. Now, I don't think we should belittle that. I think that is quality evidence from experts who say, well, I spend a lot of time interviewing coaches. I think that's my primary, this is what I do more than that, more interviews than any other kind of research. And I love experts, absolute experts, telling me why they do what they do and why they think it works. I think that's evidence, and I think we should be, prouder to hold this up and advocate it for what it is, and not be willing to be dismissed that it's only testimonial evidence.
Anecdata.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
because that's something that Richard Bailey would say, isn't it? The plural of anecdote is not data.
I haven't heard that, but I like that.
But how much anecdote then equals data?
Well, I think it's a rather unkind way of saying it, isn't it? Anecdote. What we should actually be, I think, celebrating is the well-reasoned and defended testimony of coaching practitioners. If you tell me, well, if I go and interview Eddie Jones, I think, is he not going to give me some really gold gold dust stuff about coaching.
Yeah.
Well, probably. How do we learn about that? Well, okay, so we can interview them about it and say, okay, if you want to call that anecdotal, that's fine. We can go and observe them and see what they do. That's only going to get us part of the way though as well. But it might help with that element of triangulation to say, well, they're not just saying it, they are actually practicing it, and it seems to be going on. But I think the challenge for us then remains, can we show movement, improvement from the people that we're working with, and how can we really align that to how we are coaching in the environments that we design? And I think that's still the challenge.
It's interesting because you've answered one of the questions I was going to ask, which was whether the lack of objective evidence, is based on the limitations of our experimental design. And do you also think, though, that something like human development and the complexity doesn't particularly lend itself to some of the objective methodology? So sometimes, I mean, Danny Newcomb's argued this, hasn't he, that you're trying to almost put the sort of square peg into the round hole by the very act of trying to measure some of this stuff in the way we try and measure it with the constraints of time and everything else, mean that it's got huge inherent limitations, and therefore, but so that's one thing. Yeah, I do, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
But in a lot of the research I've read, and admittedly, I'm not necessarily reading it perhaps with as critical a lens as I should, but it feels to me like I can't quite understand why the experiments are designed in the way they're designed sometimes.
Okay.
I almost think you've put some stuff in there that doesn't really answer the kind of question that needs to be answered.
Right.
So I don't know whether that's because they need to do that to satisfy academic rigour. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
With various, or because for me, I think the best experiments are the ones that are trying to solve the questions that the real world practitioner is asking. And I'm not sure it's always possible to do so, but it feels to me like sometimes when those, I can't think of an exact example of this, but it feels to me like they often like add in extra layers. Like there's a particular control group who don't have the intervention, and there's another one, and there's another one, there's another one, and the fact there are 4 almost means to me that like, oh, now you've just got far too much variability in play. Whereas in actual fact, if you did just go, right, there's this group and this group, I know that would be limited in terms of its methodological design, but at least you could go, well, that's taught us something about this. Now we'll do a different group, and now we'll do a different one. Do you know what I mean? But I don't know.
Yeah, I think depending where you live in the world and what kind of research will get you funding might dictate sometimes the types of designs that you need to say that you're going to do. And there are well-established protocols for having multiple different groups in a sort of randomized control time group design. And then you've got the elements of crossover, i.e. whether one group have an intervention, the other group don't, and then you cross over after a while, and how many layers you put that through, so whether you've got 7 different things that you're trying to intervene with over the course of time. So all of those things are inherently part of, I guess, a broader social sciences or even bioscientific sciences research design methods perspective. I think what those sorts of approaches are doing are, as Danny would say, I think trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. I'm just not convinced that that's going to work ever. And I think so. I fear trying to battle that, or go into that fight and thinking I'm not sure we're ever going to win it. So I think we might be, just because the world is too complex, not because I don't believe that the approach is right, but I think we need to be pitching this in a different way and arguing from a different standpoint, essentially.
Yeah, and it feels to me like it needs to be multidisciplinary.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It has to be.
Yeah.
It has to be. Otherwise, you end up reducing everything down to very simplistic. And so this is my other challenge, or another challenge, I think, for the constraints communities. I think the research talks about broader influences on design and perception, for example. It will talk about environment, But for me, the constraint stuff hasn't gone to environment, and certainly not environment at a social-cultural level in any way so far. And that would be part of my challenge next, to say, okay, there is some great work out there on decision-making by Jean-Paul Griheg. There's some, I think it's fantastic. And it really gets to the cultural influences on decision-making, or starts to help us think about that. So at a really practical level, thinking, well, if you play for the club X, the traditions of that club and what it's known for, and what stories are told about the great players for this club and what they were famed for, what they're prided for, will probably have an influence on the decisions that young players make in trying to come through that academy and that system. And that might be a different set of decisions and influences than the club 10 miles down the road, who are playing in the same environmental conditions, on the same kinds of grass and all that kind of thing, with the same amount of players, but culturally there's a very different ethos to the club and their developmental setup. And I think that's an inherently important part of understanding why we coach in the way that we do, and all of those influences in that environment. And my challenge to perhaps the constraints community at the moment is going, I'm not sure they've gone there yet in any great depth, other than to say it's kind of out there, isn't it? Be aware of that. But then does reduce down very quickly to practice design and very what is a very niche understanding of motor learning in that sense. So I think there is a broader world to consider. I don't necessarily think the games-based literature has gone there either much, but well, I'm quite interested in that stuff. There is some important lessons to be learned in there.
One of the things that you've talked about as we've been talking about this, you've distinguished between games-based and constraints-led. And I think for some people, perhaps listening, they're going, hang on, aren't they the same? So how do you distinguish the two?
So I think their theoretical underpinning is different. I think they're coming from a different place.
Okay.
Now, I'm not at all saying these are contradictory, but I guess perhaps you might point at me and go, this is your academic flaw. I guess because I would take this right the way back to like an epistemological level. What do you believe about the world? How is it constructed? What is the nature of truth? Which gets back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of, this is my truth, this is your truth. Who am I to say that my truth is more valuable than yours? All of that. So if you come through that chain and you start thinking, how does the world work, all the way down through to how does this inform the way that we think people learn? Therefore, how do we think we believe that learning environments could be constructed, and therefore what methods could we use in order to gather information on that? If you think that's a chain for me that begins, that informs the way that we look at the world, the way that we should coach, and the way that we understand how it all pieces together. And at some point in there, you identify a theoretical perspective, one that says this is the way that governs the way that we think the world works. So for me, constraints-led approaches are based in dynamical systems theory, which comes from ecological psychology. And that is just a different world from what for me, a games-based approach comes from a social constructivist perspective. And that's a different kind of place than dynamical systems theory and ecological psychology. I don't think they are the same, but I don't think they're necessarily contradictory. But I think they are different assumptions about the world in that sense and how it works. So I think the danger then is that we either conflate the things and we say, oh, it's all kind of the same stuff. Is that a danger? I'm not sure. Perhaps that's just me. But if that means that what I often see from coaches, or the danger of it, is that they will then cherry pick ideas from different things and say, I'm going to take that little piece from here, that little piece from here, that little piece from here, and that little piece from here. But if that means you're cherry picking things that are drawn essentially from a different belief about the world and how it's constructed, then you might actually be picking things which are contradictory to each other. And actually, so the classic is, for me, what some coaches get tied up in knots with about guided discovery, or those kind of discovery-led approaches, where what they end up doing through cherry picking various bits and pieces, is to set up a game and say, I want to play this game, but will have constrained it in such a way in that language, or perhaps in a game sense language, will have modified it in such a way that they are looking for a particular solution that they're going to try and guide people to.
Yeah.
And what they end up doing is some elaborate game of can you guess what I'm thinking?
Yeah.
Until we get to can you guess what I'm thinking? And that's where we'll get to at the end. And after a little while, people cotton onto that, and they'll start not offering contributions, or they'll start just playing along or giving you the glib lag, because they know at the end of the day you're going to tell them the answer anyway.
Question fatigue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Partly question fatigue, but partly feeling, I think, for some athletes almost undermined by the process.
Yeah.
So when I was doing a project with the Coach Logic software, there was one of the groups of athletes were brilliant, as they said, we got really engaged with the coach asking us how the scrum was going and what we thought we were doing and all this kind of thing. We really put in, and then they felt really undermined when the coach came back in and said, I take all that, but this is what we're going to do, actually. And I think, well, why do we bother with all of that discussion if you knew where you wanted to get to? And some coaches sort of celebrated that alignment of saying, we'd analysed the video and we'd come up with some points, and we got the players to do it, and we came up with the same thing and it aligned. Now, in one way, I can see why you were celebrating. In another way, I'm saying, if all you're trying to do is trying to tunnel them to a point of your consensus, then that's a limitation for me in terms of the true guidedness, the true discovery of your approach.
Right. So
for me, it would be a purer approach to say, hey, here's a clip, or here's a section that I'd like you to look at. You could frame it in whatever way you want, but I think if you're going to do that legitimately, you've got to be willing to go in the direction that the players come up with, and if they think something is important, then go with that.
So, if you're coming, just to kind of drill into that a bit more, and I think what's really nice about this is it's quite a practical conversation about how these things manifest themselves. So to bring to life the difference between a practitioner who's aligned to, say, a games-based approach, what their session might look like, versus somebody who's, say, more ecologically driven, what would be the difference?
I'm not sure there is a difference.
Right. But you talked about your beliefs about how humans operate in the world, or how we, about the world. What would be, so for example, if you were to go and observe somebody, and you talk about coaches cherry picking, which you mentioned like the guided discovery, that's what more within where does that sit?
Well, I would probably call that like an empirical constructivism. It's a very the truth is out there approach. It's post-positivistic. We're going to guide you.
I know what it is. I'm going to help you
to get there.
I'm going to help you dig, unlock the treasure.
Yeah,
that I know is there.
Yeah. Which is different from, say, a socially constructed perspective, where we might say, okay, let's uncover this and see where we go with it. And I don't know the end point here. I don't know where we're going at the end. I've got some ideas of how I'm going to help you to scaffold this, but the learning that you take from this, who am I to control that? I'll try and scaffold that, but I've no understanding, or I've no control over what you learn.
Right.
So let's go on this journey together, and we might end up at X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
Or B, C, or D. I have no idea. Perhaps when we start with. So it depends on what you consider the truest nature of discovery to be, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, and so interestingly, I've had Kendall McQuaid on a couple of times, and he refers to guided exploration. I'm with you whilst we both not discover, but we both explore the possibilities available to us.
Yeah, great.
Now, realistically, I've challenged him about this, not necessarily on the podcast, but over, curry afterwards, whatever he's been coaching my son. I actually think he is actually more guided discovery than he realises, in the sense that I think he has in his mind got some truths and realities about how somebody hits a golf ball.
Yeah.
And he thinks that they're sort of, they're kind of fundamental. So it's not true exploration in a sense. But what he is actually quite capable of doing, which is interesting, is almost disabusing himself of what he thinks he knows.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite hard, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's one of the reasons why I find in the coach development world, I think that often novice coaches can come to an ecological, non-linear, kind of world much more readily because they don't know anything. So it's actually quite easy, and I think for a lot of them, I've certainly found this. They're almost like going, "Oh, this is great. What we can do is we create these environments. It's really fun, and if kids can explore, and we can be there with them, exploring and guiding, and there isn't really a right or a wrong." And for a lot of people who haven't got necessarily a technical background in the sport, that's really liberating, and they can come at that really easily.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for the rest of us who've kind of developed our ideas around how the game's played and what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done, it's very hard, isn't it, to switch that off?
Absolutely is. But I think if you're genuinely going to go down that road, then you've got to be willing to back yourself and go for it. So I would like to think that sometimes if I'm working with one of the 16s and we're looking at some clips of video, for example, and if we're willing to ask the question, what do you see here? What are you thinking? What are you trying to work on? Then you've got to go with what they say. Mm-hmm. So if they say something that you weren't expecting, well, if that's where their head is at and that's what is true for them at that moment, then start there. So you might be thinking, well, actually, this is about trying to play forwards quickly in this situation, and they're saying, oh, actually, it was about recognizing what my opponent was doing. Then it's to be able to. Then I think the best approach is to be able to say, okay, go with what they're thinking, start there, rather than necessarily try and funnel it into what you think it's about. And for me, that's a more socially constructive way of piecing it together. Mm. Now, there do come times then with the 16s program where you say, well, actually, but we need you to do this now because we're going to have to play, and we're going to have to play together in a coherent way. But that doesn't mean that more broadly the relationship we have with the girls is saying, but that is just part of your journey. And what I work with you one-on-one here around a computer or just in the coffee shop, etc., and we're just having a chat about your development, that's the real heart of it. By the way, we're going to need to go to the pitch and we're going to have to talk to you about principles of outletting, and how to change from a back four to a back three or something like that. We might need to talk about that because that's a system that we need to do as a team but actually your development is somewhere else. We're having different conversations about that because that's where your headspace is at the moment and what you need to be working on. And I think that's great. That's where we should be going. But yeah, the difference though I think is interesting because I've observed a lot of coaches who would say they're constraints led. Yeah. And I often come away thinking, if you told me you were just a game sense coach, I couldn't have said no. I've seen exactly the same thing. So another challenge to the constraints community would say, I think you need to, if this is going to be a thing, genuinely, then more clearly articulate how it is different, better. What else does this give me? Yeah. Part of my criticism, not my criticism, that's the wrong word, part of my reservation would come. So at the same conference I mentioned earlier that Stephen Harvey spoke about the volume of evidence for TGFU, David Kirk stood up and with a presentation that was something like, is TGFU a concept that only test pilots can fly? Yeah, I've said that before. You see that? Yeah. And I was thinking, gosh, teaching games for understanding, games-based approaches, conceptually is pretty simple, isn't it? It's about exaggeration and representation, and it's about now. The part of his argument was, we've flogged this for 30 years, and to be honest, we haven't got anywhere with it.
It's true, isn't it?
And his argument was, whilst the concepts are simple, its application is really difficult. Oh yeah. And it is difficult. So I was sat there thinking, gosh, if game sense and TGFU is too complicated for most coaches to administer, where are we at with constraints-led approaches, which has, as we all know, a whole nother level of jargonistic terminology that covers that body of thinking. So, the workshops that we're doing for England Hockey at the moment are about trying to simplify that and to talk in language that is understandable. But I'm still doing defensive principles workshop with one of the principles to self-organise against fluid shapes as a defensive principle. Now, I would like to think that by the end of the workshop we've kind of grasped as a group what we mean by that. But part of me is also thinking, gosh, this is that's a leap, isn't it, for most coaches?
Yeah.
And it's not that simple.
Yeah.
And for those of us who have the pleasure of working in coaching for a living, read this stuff all the time, talk about it all the time, and we're still wrestling with it and trying to work it out and understand it. When we work with coaches who are brand new to this stuff, and we have to be really careful that we are and how we deliver it. But but that warning then from David Kirk resonates with me strongly. It's going, well, if we couldn't get TGFU embedded with its very simple concepts of it's a very simple processing model, and Linda Griffin simplified it even more and just said, play a game, ask some questions, do some skill development, just do 3 things under 4 general principles: representation, tactical complexity, exaggeration, etc. And we didn't get a great deal of take up, or limited impact and limited evidence, then that's warning bells for me for the constraints-led community, saying, okay, that's a big challenge, is to try and do this in a different way if it's going to have genuine impact. Now you've got the added influence now of a very different body of influencers on the sporting community, I think, who are driving this. So you never had that with teaching games for understanding or games-based models. There was no political drive from above that's going to push this through. So that's maybe a different context.
Yeah.
But the inherent complexity of the theory and of the language that goes with it, I think, is still quite a significant bridge to cross for the community.
And that's interesting in itself. I think you're totally right. And it's a question I ask myself all the time. What would give me more pause would be if I didn't see what I do see, which is what I said earlier on, which is novice coaches going, this is something I can get hold of. Now that doesn't necessarily mean they can do it, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's something that they can do with any great ability or skill necessarily. But the very fact that they can embrace the idea and understand that, oh yeah, so if I change the environment in such and such a way, I might bring about a change in the way the athlete behaves. That's an interesting idea. I want to just float an idea past you though. I feel like constraint-led approach as a term might be problematic.
Because it starts with constraint.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and and the idea of, so, Danny's talked about this, and I've heard, read in the literature, the idea of constraining to afford. And let's put a constraint in place because it sort of directs attention in a certain area, in a certain way. I like that as an idea. But then I think to myself, well, why are we talking about that? Why don't we talk about an affordance-led approach? Now, that's a big problem because terminology-wise, it's a challenge. But if we could grasp the idea that actually what we're interested in is what is it an athlete is exploring, and we might use constraints as a means by which, as one of the tools, or as a range of tools, in order to place a lens or a gaze on a specific area. I really like the analogy, again, Keith David's analogy, which is the field of affordances. So the way I conceive of it is, if you imagine a load of fields, dry stone walls, and there are gates, and there could be a big landscape where all those gates are open. So there's lots and lots of things that you could do. You go anywhere. Yeah. Close some of those gates, and all of a sudden now we're just going to operate in 1 or 2 fields, and now we're exploring this thing. And I like the idea of that. It sort of feels to me like that's the way to do it. But the idea of, when you talk about constraint, and it's not a surprise to me that a lot of coaches constrain in order to bring about immediate behaviour change, and thinking that that's going to transfer into learning. And that's not, in my opinion, that's not what we're trying to do. No. What we're trying to do is to use constraints as a means by which to allow the athlete to explore something without some of the other noise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's an important distinction that I think hasn't quite been conveyed as well as it should.
Yeah.
So maybe the change of term might affordance led.
But I'd still come back and say, well, why are we talking about affordances? So I'm going to come back and defend an old-fashioned game sense approach.
Yeah.
And I love. So Richard Light was the main advocate of game sense. I still think it's great. I love it. And instead of constraints and affordances, we'd be talking about modify.
Yeah.
Or change.
Yeah. Condition.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And
that's the language people often say when I talk about constraints. You mean conditions?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, your conditions. And what are we trying to do with it? Well, we're trying to either exaggerate a particular thing, or we're trying to make sure it represents. And I reckon for 99.9% of coaches, that's what we're at. That's what you'll actually see. That's what we're doing anyway. So I'm thinking, what might we have a better chance if we used that kind of language? If we're going to take a constraints language and go with that because we think it's the truth about the world, we're in a ecological, derived from ecological psychology, etc. If that's the truth, then perhaps okay, I can accept that. But as a social constructivist, I'm coming from another lens. I'm thinking, well, actually, I'm not sure what we're adding with the enhanced complexity of the language, the terminology, the jargon that we didn't get, that wasn't already out there with some of with the game sense approaches, for example. And so that's part of my challenge. Where I go, well, come on, really nail down for me. What are we adding here that wasn't in there? Because I genuinely haven't seen it yet, and I've watched Danny Kerry coach, and I could legitimately see that and say, well, yeah, that was pretty game sense as an approach. And what I think game sense gives you more than constraints does, and apologies, this is not a criticism session. This is trying to provoke some thought. What I think the game sense literature does better is talk about that. Is talk about dialogue and talking and the place of that within the learning pathway. Yeah. And now game sense is really strong on that. And I use it all the time with our 16s girls. I'm probably not supposed to say that, but that principle of saying, "Hey, look, we're going to play 8 on 8 here, and we're going to look at some outletting patterns. Girls, want you to come up with your plan. Go and strategize. Have a little bit of a think. Now go play. Go and do it, and we'll talk about your plan after you've played for 10 minutes. Yeah. Come back in. Let's talk about your." Play 10 minutes, come back, let's talk about that, modify it. And that very discussion-based, collective, collaborative strategizing is inherently part of the game sense models of... Now, I think almost every constraints-led approach coach I've seen does exactly that. But it's not in the literature. So if I look at the Chow textbook, there's nothing about collaborative discussion in that book at all.
So it's all about... So where you would place the distinction is that a constraints-led approach has very little intervention, verbal intervention, in the sense if you take it in its true theoretical ecological underpinning, the idea is I create an environment and organisms then self-organise within that environment in certain ways.
That's the danger is if you go, because of where it's come from, it's a very natural systems model, isn't it? That wasn't modelled to have humans in it and to have talking and interaction and that kind of thing. Yeah. Now,
with our brains.
Yeah. Now, absolutely, the likes of Keith Davies mentioned a lot of times, but a lot of the other constraints-led writers are building those links and will be talking about the place of humanity in this model. Absolutely. But they haven't got there yet, or it's part of that argument about the whole social cultural thing. I think they're still a long way off really nailing that down. So it will come, because we know, coming from the other end, from a very pragmatic end, coaches know we need to talk to people, and that actually people do learn when they talk to each other. And when I talk to a player who's better than me at something, or if I can help them to learn and they can help me to learn, we know that works. And part of the other thing that some of the constraints-led group have been cautious over, for example, is the use of video. We talked about that earlier. And I know most coaches are quite, not reliant is the wrong word, but place a strong emphasis on the importance of video in people's learning journey. We know it's important. Now, within a social constructivist model of learning, that's easy. It's easy to reconcile because it's about taking that picture, that piece of the puzzle, and helping people to fit it into their picture and piecing that together. Within a constraints model, I don't think they've got there yet with explaining how that works and how that affects people's perception-action coupling when they actually get to the practice field. How does the fact that I watched this on video 10 minutes ago or 2 weeks ago, or that I've had some interaction with my coach about this, how does that affect my what I'm perceiving or what I'm deciding to do in this environment on the practice field? Now, I can see that you can make that theoretical link. Yeah, absolutely. That discussion around the video that we've had will inform how the perception action couple is framed, and it's about the principles, I guess, under which we would try and shape our participants' behaviour or help them to shape their behaviour. But I don't think anybody has written that yet. And so my challenge again to the community would be, okay, that surely has got to come quickly, because the advocates of the approach use video all of the time. Danny Carey's a great video user, and all of the coaches are that I know of. I don't know a performance coach who doesn't use video anymore. And so I think the place of that within the game sense literature is much better established, is even more readily available than it is in the constraints literature at the moment. And that's not to say that it won't come. I think it probably will.
But given what you've said about let's say that they're not, let's say that the constraints-led approach and the game sense are, if not brother and sister, at least cousins. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And so because of their relatedness, actually those two things sitting alongside each other isn't an issue for us necessarily, is it? No, as long as we're clear on that. Because like you say, I think part of the problem, I don't think it's necessarily a problem either. It's not a problem that somebody thinks that they're constraints-led, but actually they're following a game sense model necessarily. No. And so maybe another way of looking at it could be that the constraints-led approach is perhaps just bringing a different methodological framework to game sense?
Potentially. But here's a danger that I have come across in the last 12 months from a hockey coach in our community who's trying to be constraints-led and said to me, but we shouldn't be using video anymore, should we? Because it breaks the perception-action couple. There's no relevance there. Now, we haven't yet got a frame in order to legitimately piece that back together and to argue that, because nobody's written it. But from a very pragmatic perspective, we know how much value we can derive from really good, interactive, collaboratively constructed, athlete-led analysis of their performance via video. And so that would be part of my caution, I guess, over some of our constraints. So there are absolutely some of the bits that the constraints-led approach has brought to the table. I agree, have absolutely advanced our thinking in terms of practice design. What I would say, though, I think, is in terms of any of those elements, they still fall very comfortably for me within a game sense model, saying this is...
I see it as nested.
Yeah, no, I understand that, absolutely. So I would come at it from a different perspective, from you saying this alongside each other, and say, well, are some of these ideas that have, if they can sit alongside or within a game sense model, then they're additions to my game sense model. They help me to be better at modifying activity. Yeah. But actually what my game sense frame does is give me a more solid foundation for my social cultural leanings and my place of the off-field stuff and how that influences my learning journey. I have a better, stronger frame for that. But this has helped me with my on-field stuff. And then the danger just is then that if we don't help people to really distinguish between those things, and you end up cherry picking things which do end up being inherently contradictory, then we might be, damaging learning journeys instead of enhancing them sometimes. But I think, hey, we do that all the time, don't we? Anyway, because we talk about very constructively pieced together understandings, and then we say, yeah, but we do need you to do this in the game.
Yeah.
So there's that inherent.
I suppose for anybody who's listening to the podcast who's up to now been thinking, right, I'm on to something here. I'm on board with the journey, the constraints journey, and they've now heard this and gone, hang on a second, now I'm thrown into turmoil. It's probably worth mentioning that what neither of us are saying here is that we think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong about the idea, the concept, the theory, the principles that it's founded upon. What we're saying is we almost feel like the research now needs to catch up with the practice.
Definitely, in the constraints of absolutely definitely, and I'm not saying that it won't. I think it probably will.
Yeah.
And you can see that in not many years, and it's going to be a burgeoning area, and there are going to be lots of constraints-led texts and books coming out all over the place, because it will generate that kind of following, and there will be a mass of people who would sign themselves up and say, I'm a constraints-led advocate, I believe in this, and I'll be saying, great, brilliant. I might still be slightly over here with actually I'm still a social constructivist, and I think game sense is where I'm at. I might be still over there. I might be a convert, and I might have been convinced that actually this is the world model that we need to follow. But you're right, in terms of practice, it probably won't mean a radical shift in that. But in terms of my theoretical justification of where we're coming from and how it all links together, that would be a little bit of a shift for me. But yeah, no, absolutely not going with this is wrong, this is right. It's a journey that we're exploring, and we're just trying to understand it, because it's really, really complex. We're trying to get our heads around how it works in practice, and that theory to practice gap is still huge. Yeah. And with the best will in the world, the best and most informed experts that the likes of the proper people that you have on this podcast often, or that you listen to, they still haven't got it either. Yeah. By the way, still wrestling with it all the time. And I think those that are the very best are humble enough to say, well, it's a very softly held opinion in many ways. I think Mark Williams is brilliant from that perspective, that probably one of the most richly underpinned academics in the world in terms of sport, but I think comes across as really really humble in his position of understanding this really complex stuff that is talent development, skill acquisition system. It's just really complicated. So all we're trying to do is do things for the best of our athletes, taking really good professional decisions about what we think is best for them at particular times, and then trying to justify the underpinnings for that. For me, that's part of what I'm about, is really understanding where it all comes from, what it's based on. And if we've done that to the best of our ability, and that happens to be different from somebody else, then that's okay. In fact, that's inevitable, because you'll never think the same as anybody else. So,
and you're right though. I think your point about that you made right at the start of this around people trying to say my truth is better than your truth. The reality is that's a position that no one should really hold. But it is right to say, why do you believe that to be true? And also to say, and there's some stuff here that might be worth having a look at, as an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely.
The one thing I do struggle with a little bit though is, people do have a need for certainty.
Yeah.
If you're going to invest time and energy, and you're going to place yourself in this, I think people are looking for some element of certainty as a means by which to justify the energy and the time. And so I think that's one of the reasons why often organisations feel as if they need to give people some sense of certainty, some justification, which I sort of get. But the danger is, like you say, it comes across as being, this is right now. What we did before was wrong. Now we're doing what we're doing is right. The danger is there that people just think, I've heard this all before. I guess that's the point. It'll all blow over. So my point though is to try and find the right way of saying, look, we don't know we're right. We don't know we're wrong either. But we think there's something in this that we're going to explore for a while.
Yeah.
And ideally, we'd like you to come along with us because we feel it'll give us the best opportunity to do the best thing. My big driver and my central justification for the approach comes back to this idea of, I feel that alternative approaches are often justified from the perspective of the improvement of technique and performance. That's the justification. Whereas I'm often coming from this to say, the methodology I'm looking for is one that blends the best experience possible for the individual from a enjoyment of the activity, combined with the opportunity to develop as well.
Yeah.
And that's where I come from, because I've lived in this trying to sort of navigate between participation and performance my entire life.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons I'm very aligned to this as an idea, because I feel it gives us the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And that's why I would continue to explore it. But I recognise that the danger of that, and this is where I started the whole conversation, which was...
But if you're after certainty, then you've come to the wrong world, really, haven't you? But if we take evidence bases of the hardest sciences that there are out there, and you'll very quickly become, very practical example, how do you cure the common cold? Well, we don't know. We haven't got there. We can understand it, but and then even with very sophisticated forms of, say, cancer treatment, these are all models based in probabilistic science.
Yeah.
None of which will ever claim there is a 100% success.
Yeah.
It's all with a degree of error and with a degree of probability. So in that sense, we will never have evidence that will provide us with certainty ever.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're working in a social cultural world blows that perspective for me out of the water. We'll never get close to that. But I think you're right that we can just keep exploring things for a while, trying to understand them as best we can.
Make sense of them.
Make sense of them, absolutely. Keep checking the evidence as it arrives and weighing its relative credibility to help us, knowing that it's only ever going to be bits and pieces here and there that might inform the way that we're moving. And if we can help people with that journey, then that for me, that's what we're trying to do. But certainty is an impossibility for me.
Well, I could sit here and talk to you all day. I do have to get on the road. I'm going to pick my children up from childminders.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned before about some of the workshops you do, and I know you are actively working with various organisations and this, that and the other. I have sat in a workshop you've run, which helped me piece together the various different learning theories and where I was sort of sitting in social constructivism and all these ideas. So if somebody wanted to say, hey, I'd like you to come and help me with some of this, or I've got a group of people here who'd like to learn from you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Great. I'm on Twitter. I'm not a particularly active Twitterer, but if you tweet me, then that's a good way. So it's at Donald Vinson.
I keep trying to bait you into these.
Oh, I see.
You're quite good at it. You stay out of it. But I do try to drag you into my murky world.
I will. I'll try and be better at that. Or they can obviously email me at my university address, which is d.vinson@worc.ac.uk. The two best methods.
Cool.
And if your heart is about learning and helping other people to learn and to grow and to develop, then we'll have a pretty cool conversation about that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
Stu, thank you. Great.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
Thanks for coming on the podcast, Don. It was fantastic to be able to catch up and, in true Talent Equation style, do so in a emergent fashion that just came about through pure chance, because I happened to be in his neck of the woods after having done some coach development work in Worcester. Really great. It's been a long time. I've been really looking forward to catching up with Don. I've known him for quite some time. I always find him really stimulating and really interesting. Got fantastically engaging manner and personality, and I highly recommend, if you get the chance to attend one of his workshops, or if you're even thinking about doing some kind of postgraduate course in coaching, then Don's course comes highly recommended. I've actually been a guest lecturer on in the past, so even more reason to sign up. But certainly as a lecturer or somebody that you can learn with, fantastic guy who will definitely go the extra mile to support your learning. Onward and upward, as I've been saying recently, we've got some other learning and development opportunities coming up. The Future of Coaching Conference is happening in the new year on the 4th of January, and recently announced Talent Equation Live, which is happening up in Scotland, with the generous and much needed support of the guys at Stuart Melville's College in Edinburgh. I'll be there on the 29th of March with colleagues including Sarah Kelleher, Danny Newcomb, Fletch and Rusty from the Magic Academy, Mark Bennett. It's an all-star lineup and sure to be a great event. So head on over to my webpage and you'll be able to find more details about that. In the meantime, have a great week of coaching, and remember, ditch those drills.